Sadness and outrage tonight after another school shooting in America.
Good afternoon, this is News 2, and we're following a breaking story today, a shooting at a high school in Littleton, Colorado.
There's word potentially multiple children have been killed. This happened at the Robb Elementary School in the Uvalde Consolidated Independent School District.
2012 Colorado movie theater massacre.
7 bodies were discovered in Oklahoma.
2 mosques in Christchurch were targeted, the country's worst mass shooting ever.
Hello everyone. I hope you all are having a good day. I happened upon this case while researching international shootings. I found it very interesting, and I'm sure you will too. A quick warning, this case took place in the 90s, and there were certain parts that were very hard to research, as there was next to no information available. I did my best to gather as much information as I could without including inaccurate details. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed today's video. It was a warm and sunny afternoon in the Strathfield suburb of Sydney, Australia. The local Strathfield shopping centre was brimming with visitors. Shoppers were enjoying a relaxing day of browsing stores. People were having lunch at the cafes, and local school kids were enjoying their weekend off. All was well, until a man suddenly began a deadly shooting spree that would end the lives of 7 innocent victims, injuring several more. Our case today revolves around a man by the name of Wade John Frankham. Frankham was born in 1958. He was raised by strict parents, rarely ever receiving affection or approval. Growing up, Frankham attended an all-boys K-8 boarding school. He then went on to attend Homebush Boys High School as he got older. After he graduated, Frankham held numerous dead-end jobs, but ultimately landed a job as a part-time taxi driver, sometime in the year before the shooting. Frankham's father died in 1986 from emphysema. 5 years later, in April of 1990, his heartbroken mother took her own life by sitting in her running car inside of her enclosed garage. After her death, Frankham moved in with his sister and her boyfriend. His neighbors at the time described him as a kind, regular guy, friendly but quiet, a loner. One neighbor said, quote, "He would spend the whole day in the house and never go out apart from down to the local shop to buy milk and cigarettes, and then he would go out at night and drive his taxi." Despite his noticeably unusual personality, no one could have predicted the horror that Frankham would go on to commit. Before I get into the details, I did want to say that most sources state Frankham injured 6 people on top of killing 7. Although, different sources state varying information about the injured victims. So I'm not entirely sure how many were truly injured, because I even saw a few sources that list the total number as 8. I'll list all of the potentially injured people that I gathered during my research. On August 17, 1991, around 1 p.m., Wade Frankham, now 33, made his way to Strathfield Plaza, which was and still is a shopping center located in the inner west of Sydney, Australia. When he arrived at the plaza, Frankham decided to take a seat in an open-concept cafe called the Coffee Pot. He was there for quite a while, enjoying a few cups of coffee. There were 2 teenage girls sitting behind Frankham in the cafe, and they kept noticing that he would continually turn around to look at them. They were a little put off by his behavior, but ultimately dismissed it. At about 3:30 p.m., Frankham suddenly, and without provocation, pulled a 20-inch blade from his duffel bag. He then turned around, smiled, and began to stab one of the teenage girls repeatedly in the back. Her name was Roberta Armstrong, and she was only 15 at the time of her death. Roberta's friends screamed at the sight and quickly ran to the cafe's counter to hide. I read on one source that Roberta's friend was also stabbed, but it wasn't reported on all sources, so I'm not entirely sure if it's true or not. After stabbing Roberta to death, Frankham didn't even bother to pull the knife out of Roberta's back, before he equipped himself with a Chinese-made SKS semi-automatic rifle that he also got out of the duffel bag. First, Frankham shot into the air, but he quickly began to unleash gunfire upon the cafe's customers. Joyce Nixon, who was 61, was killed alongside her 36-year-old daughter, Patricia Rowe. The 2 women were shot to death as they desperately lifted a table to shield Patricia's 2 young sons from the gunfire. Thankfully, their efforts weren't in vain, as both boys were unharmed. Sitting on the other side of the cafe was Carol Dickinson, who was 47, her daughter, 20-year-old Belinda, as well as Belinda's 17-year-old cousin, Rochelle Milburn. When the shooting began, Carol pushed her daughter Belinda behind an object, enabling her to escape. As she screamed for her daughter to get away, Carol was shot in the chest, which ultimately killed her. 17-year-old Rachel was shot in the head and died instantly. Cafe owner George Marvis emerged from the kitchen to see what was going on and was subsequently shot dead. George's brother James was also in the cafe at the time of the shooting. He said that as the shooting began, he dove behind a coffee machine to shield himself. James later stated, quote, "I was making the coffee. My brother was in the kitchen cooking. He came out to see what was happening, and by the time I got up again, my brother was dead." While some people chose to hide, there were also a ton of people running throughout the plaza frantically attempting to escape the shooting. After he shot and killed the 5 people inside of the cafe, Frankham fled from the scene, out into the main area of the shopping center. The owner of a nearby photography shop, Ann McGill, recounted, quote, "Little kids were hiding at the back of my shop, saying their prayers." While walking through the plaza, Frankham came upon Franklin's supermarket and began to open fire towards the people in the store. A man named Sotirios Formakis, an employee of the supermarket, said that as he was walking into the shop, Frankham appeared. He came out and fired the shots overhead, and everyone was falling to the ground. He shot everyone in his way. "Luckily, I ducked down," Sotirios said. Frankham struck one woman in the arm before shooting another in the leg. At the same time, he ended up shooting and killing 53-year-old Robertson Canhawk Voon. Frankham then fled to a nearby parking garage, making his way to the rooftop level. I read that Frankham shot a young couple here, who ended up surviving, as well as a cleaner who also survived. A 41-year-old man named Gregory Reed, who was an ex-Navy officer, had already ran to the top of the parking garage to alert other people of the active shooter. As he was warning people to get out of there, he noticed Frankham coming up behind him. Gregory attempted to dive behind a car, but he was shot in both of his feet as he did. He later said from his hospital bed, quote, "I heard the shots when I was in the news agency, and I raced out. I saw everybody running, and a lady screamed, 'Look out! A man's gone berserk with a gun.' The shots started coming towards me. I could see he was running to get out of the building. I raced up the stairs as he ran up the ramp. I reached the parking garage first and told a couple to hit the deck. Then, as I warned a woman driving out of the parking garage to lie low, she said, 'It's too late. He's already behind you.' I turned, and he was just a couple meters away. I dived under the car, and that's how I got shot in the feet." Frankham continued his spray of bullets, piercing the woman's vehicle multiple times. Thankfully, all of the shots missed her, and she was not harmed. Frankham then turned his attention to attempting to gain entry into the adjoining Social Security Department building, but he was unable to break the locks on the doors. Frankham gave up on the idea, and instead aimed his gun over the rooftop wall and began to fire at the nearby Strathfield Railway and taxi stand. 2 people were injured from this burst, but they ended up surviving. A woman named Catherine Noyes was completely unaware of the unfolding terror as she drove up to the rooftop level of the parking garage and parked her car. Frankham ran up to her vehicle and aimed the gun at her head, demanding, quote, "Drive me to Enfield!" Enfield is another suburb of Sydney, only a short 5-minute drive away. There are multiple different accounts of the following events, so I'll just go with the timeline I saw reported the most. Catherine complied with his demands and began to start her car. Before she was able to, though, Frankham paused as he heard multiple police sirens approaching the parking garage. He turned to Catherine and said, quote, "I'm really sorry. Stop." He then exited the vehicle, knelt on the ground, and put the rifle to his chin. Catherine looked away just as she heard a gunshot ring out. Frankham had just taken his own life. The deadly shooting spree lasted a mere 10 minutes, but despite the short length, 7 people had lost their lives. 6 to 8 more were injured by Frankham's random gunfire. None of his victims knew Frankham personally. I scoured several sites and reports searching for any information on the 7 innocent victims that lost their lives. I'm not sure if it's because it's an older case, but unfortunately, I found next to nothing about most of them. I sincerely apologize that I wasn't able to include more. Roberta Blanche Armstrong was born on February 6, 1976, in New South Wales, Australia. She was 15 years old at the time of her death. Joyce Patricia Nixon was born sometime in 1960 and died at the age of 61. Patricia Lorraine Rowe was 36 years old at the time of her death. Carol Dickinson was 47 years old when she was killed. 17-year-old Rachel Milburn was born on April 11, 1974. She was the oldest of her siblings, about to start her final exams in high school. Rachel was planning to spend the day with her cousin, Belinda, and Aunt Carol, which is why she went to Strathfield Plaza in the first place. Her mom dropped her off at 1 p.m. that day, not knowing it would be the last time she saw her daughter. It would only be a few hours later when Rachel was murdered. George Marvis, the owner of the cafe, was born on November 8, 1939. He was 51 years old when he was killed. Robertson Conhock Voon was killed at the age of 51. Police estimated that Gregory Reed's brave and heroic actions saved at least 8 lives. He was awarded the Star of Courage in October of 1992 for his selfless act of courage in circumstances of great peril. This award is the second highest Australian bravery decoration. He continued to state he was no hero, saying, quote, "I just acted on the spur of the moment." An investigation was launched into Frankum's past and personality, which revealed a bleak history. The investigators found that Frankum had no previous criminal record, showing no signs of violence. They, however, found that Frankum solicited prostitutes regularly. When they conducted a search of his apartment, they found pornography and violent movies, magazines, and books. One of these books was American Psycho by Bret Easton Ellis. Frankum's copy of American Psycho was said to be heavily worn, leading authorities to believe that he read through it frequently. As you all likely know, American Psycho is about a seemingly normal man that leads a double life as a serial killer. Though police never found definitive evidence to suggest the novel inspired Frankum's actions on the day of his rampage, rumors suggesting it had done so began to circulate. Some people also began to look at the 1976 movie titled Taxi Driver as a possible inspiration for the shooting. After all, Frankum was a taxi driver at the time, and he had also apparently shaved his head recently, as did the main character in the movie before he went on his rampage. Investigators learned that Frankum received an inheritance of $30,000, most of which he spent meeting with several prostitutes per week. Apparently, this was the only way he saw to receive sexual relief. He ran through the inheritance quickly and soon found himself broke again. Police ended up speaking with one of the prostitutes that Frankum would meet with regularly. She said that him meeting his sexual needs was a major thing in his life. She said, quote, "If that was going to cease, that could have been catastrophic for him." In September of 1990, Frankum obtained his shooter's license. During December of the same year, he began to see a psychologist for his looming depression. On January 16, 1991, Frankum purchased the 7.62mm SKS rifle. He also picked up 100 rounds of ammunition, along with 3 magazines. Frankum explained these purchases to his sister's boyfriend, stating, quote, "It's a fucked up world out there, and there's some weird fuckers out there." The visits to his psychologist soon came to an end in February of 1991, only 2 months after he began the sessions. In April 1991, Frankum purchased the 20-inch knife he used in the later attack. Police believe that it was clear he had murder on his mind at this time in his life. Forensic psychologist Dr. Rod Milton stated that the attack was impossible to predict. He said, quote, "He was without severe mental disorder or previous evidence of severe aggression." The only motive for the shooting spree that Dr. Milton was able to come up with was a mixture of anger, guilt, conflict, and the lack of money to continue his habits. Frankum was angry because he had been seen as a failure to his parents, up until their death. He felt guilty over his mother's recent suicide, and he was in the middle of a conflict with his sister regarding their grandmother's estate. Lastly, he was completely out of money, no longer able to relieve himself of his built-up sexual frustration. Dr. Milton stated that alone, those factors wouldn't be sufficient enough to explain Frankum's motives for the day of his attack. But with the added glorification of violent material, he may have been pushed over the edge. The impact that this massacre had on the local community was devastating. A large number of people were in the area at the time, with many people being direct witnesses to the event. many of the shopping center's businesses suffered a steep decline in revenue and patronage following the incident. Because of this, many of them moved out of Strathfield Plaza. This event began a major series of changes in Australia's gun control laws. At the time, there was no limit on the number of firearms that someone could own, and there was no registration requirement to purchase semi-automatic rifles. Rebecca Peters was the coordinator of the National Coalition for Gun Control, and she led the charge to change and strengthen gun laws in Australia. She said, quote, "Anyone without a serious criminal record, anyone who hadn't already been convicted of homicide could buy a gun. It was an open invitation, not only for people who wanted to have an efficient manner of killing people and all sorts of gun traffickers, and it seemed completely mad." She began to campaign for changes to be made. A huge public demonstration in support of stronger gun laws followed. The New South Wales government implemented restrictions on semi-automatic weapons, and this helped to kickstart the move for gun law reform. Rebecca Peters said, quote, "One of our demands was proof of reason." The Strathfield shooter had claimed recreational hunting as his reason, despite the fact that everyone who knew him said he had never been hunting in his life. This process led on for quite a while. 5 years after the Strathfield Massacre, Australia's worst mass killing took place. This incident was the infamous 1996 Port Arthur Massacre. As far as I could find, after this event, their gun laws were largely impacted. Many people credit the gun law reform solely to the Port Arthur Massacre, but they fail to realize that the changes had already begun to change following the Strathfield Massacre. Rebecca Peters said it's important to remember that the Strathfield Massacre, not just the Port Arthur Massacre, led to major gun reform in the country. She said, quote, "I feel the people who died at the Strathfield Massacre didn't die in vain, that tragedy contributed to something." A tree was planted in memory of the 7 victims. A plaque rests nearby with the text reading, quote, "This tree was planted to remember those who were killed in Strathfield Plaza on Saturday the 17th of August, 1991. Roberta Armstrong, Carol Dickinson, George Mavris, Rochelle Milburn, Joyce Nixon, Patricia Rowe, Robertson Canhawk Voon. This tree is a sign of our commitment to work for a more peaceful community." Those deadly 10 minutes will never be forgotten by the local community, and all of the victims will always be remembered. I'm really sorry that I wasn't able to add any more about them. I really tried my best to find information. I'm sure all of the 7 victims were wonderful and kind people. Even though I wasn't able to find anything about most of them, I know that they didn't deserve what happened to them that day. Thank you for watching through to the end of the video. Please let me know what you thought about this case in the comments below. Also, please make sure to subscribe to my channel if you would like to learn about the cases I cover in the future. As always, until next time, stay safe.